I think a lot of people, especially Americans, they realize that National Historic Landmarks, are extremely well-known buildings, Empire State or Statue of Liberty, the Capitol building in Washington, Library of Congress, White House, etc. But only one building overseas, and it's the American Legation in Tangier. And that was because it was the first American property overseas. Yeah, so here we have the Medina of Tangier, which of course is synonymous with the city of Tangier. It was within the city walls for hundreds of years. And you can see the footprint of the American Legation, which is quite big, and it's built on either side of the pedestrian street. And here you see other large buildings along the main pedestrian street of the Medina. And those were also legations of other countries when Tangier was the capital of, or the diplomatic capital of Morocco. And here the Moroccan Ministry of Foreign Affairs was located, so the representative of the Sultan conducted diplomatic relations with countries represented in Morocco, but they were always based in Tangier, even before Tangier became the international zone of Tangier. It really starts in 1777 with this proclamation by the Sultan of Morocco listing all the countries that Morocco has commercial and trade relations with. And of course it's the usual countries, Great Britain, France, Spain, some countries that don't exist anymore like Livorno and Naples. And then he mentions the Americans. And this was very significant because it was the first time a foreign head of state takes recognition of this new country that had just declared its independence. This was in December 1777, which was when George Washington and his troops were hunkering down in the winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. So it was not really a high point of the American Revolution. So it was an audacious move on the part of the Sultan, but he had already been looking west. He had years before built the port of Mogador, which is now called Essaouira, and that was to trade with the Atlantic. So he was someone who was very visionary, looking to diversify Morocco's relations with the rest of the world. So even though this was a very important move as far as recognition from a foreign head of state, there was no reaction from the United States. So he waited 1777, 1778, and then finally, in 1784, after having waited for a number of years for an American response to his overture, he finally sends out his ships to capture an American trading vessel, the Betsy, and it's brought to Tangier along with its crew. And it was really just a ploy to attract U.S. attention, and it worked because the U.S. very soon thereafter sent Thomas Barclay, consul in France working for Benjamin Franklin and for Thomas Jefferson, sent him to negotiate a treaty between the United States and Morocco. And that's one of the oldest treaties that the United States still has in one form or another with another country. And then Barclay was to return to Morocco to be the first U.S. consul in Tangier. And he was en route back to Morocco when he died in Lisbon in 1793. But there has been an American consular presence in Tangier really from the 1790s. The early 1800s, American consuls living in Tangier. Finally, Sultan Moulay Suleiman gives this property, which becomes the American Legation, to the United States. And this was very significant because it was the first American diplomatic property outside of the United States. Up until that time, the US had simply, when it needed an embassy or a consulate, it rented a building and had it temporarily. But when the legation was given to the United States by the Sultan, that became the first and is the oldest diplomatic property. And they think that the original building was probably destroyed in the French bombardment of 1844. So the building that we're in now was built after 1844. It's essentially a 19th century of Samuel Gomir, who was the first American minister to Morocco. And a minister is the diplomatic title of someone who's in charge of a legation. And he was elevated to that rank in 1905 when the US and Morocco entered into full diplomatic relations. And so after having been a consulate and a consulate general, this building becomes a legation. throughout the rest of the 19th century and then into the 20th century, the American legation purchased other plots of land on the other side of the pedestrian street, so it expanded as it grew in importance. And in the 1930s, they built what is called the pavilion, or the Arab pavilion. And it was a long-standing American diplomat, Maxwell Blake, who was here for close to 30 years. And the building is very beautiful. It was considered to be probably the jewel of the American diplomatic buildings of the time. And it was filled with handicraft work from artisans in all of North Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, and of course Morocco, of the legation. We have some important dates in the evolution of the building and of the institution, because in 1956, when Morocco regains its independence, the legation here in Tangier reverts to being called a consulate general, and the US and other countries opened up embassies in Rabat, which was declared the capital. And so this building in the 60s becomes an Arabic language school for US Foreign Service officers, and then in the 1970s it was the Peace Corps Training Center. And then it was around the time of the American Bicentennial in 1976 that the Peace Corps no longer needed the building, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen to the building. Would it be abandoned? Would it be sold off? And there were several people, including diplomats and academics, who got together and they said, no, the historical significance of the legation is too important just to abandon. And that was the beginning of what we have now, which is the Tangier American Legation Institute for Moroccan Studies. And so it's a museum and a research library and a cultural center, and it's dedicated to tracing the history of the relationship between Morocco and the United States. So we wanted to illustrate the content of these relations in the early days. So of course, George Washington entered into correspondence with the Sultan of Morocco, and here we have facsimiles of their exchange of letters. And here we have a poster commemorating the bicentennial of the treaty between the United States and Morocco. And the same Thomas Barclay that we saw earlier was given an exequatur by the Sultan of Morocco. Exequatur is this document in Arabic which gives him the power to exercise his diplomatic function in Morocco. And since it was Morocco's outreach to the United States that led to this early establishment of relations between Morocco and the United States, we wanted to give a presentation on Moroccan diplomacy. And so here we have several images of Moroccan diplomacy going back really quite a long time, and they were very active. This is the Moroccan ambassador going to Vienna, the Moroccan ambassador to Great Britain. It was, in fact, just after the Spanish Armada. So Morocco always had this very outward-looking vision towards the Atlantic world. And we talk here about an incident that happened in 1871, where the American Consul General in Tangier, Felix Matthews, was summoned to Fez, the capital at the time. So since Moroccan diplomacy led to the opening of relations with the United States, we wanted to give a focus on Moroccan diplomacy here. And there was a period in the late 19th century when Morocco was under great pressure from Spain and from France and other European powers. And there was an incident where the American consul in Tangier, Felix Matthews, was invited to what was then the capital of Morocco, Fez. And the Sultan presented to him an offer of Morocco as an American protectorate. And so this is a relatively little known piece of Moroccan and American history. And the context of the time, of course, was not only this pressure on Morocco from European countries, and then looking at the United States as a potential benign power far enough away so as not to be a threat. But in the United States, since the focus was on post-Civil War reconstruction and going west to conquer the West, there really wasn't much focus on taking up a protectorate in Morocco. So the US politely declined the offer, and the rest is history. We have the letter written by the American consul in Tangier during the Civil War, and it's the announcement to the diplomatic corps in Tangier of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So during the Civil War, there were American consuls here who had to intervene concerning the trade between the let's say, Gibraltar, Tangier, and the Confederacy. And it was in 1862, relatively early on in the Civil War, that the American consul became aware of Confederate traders in Tangier, and he asked the Moroccan authorities to intervene and to arrest them. They were arrested, they were brought to the American legation while waiting for a Union ship to take them back to the United States. And in fact, there were European traders and commercial people who created a riot out in front of the American legation because they wanted to trade with the Confederacy. So eventually, the two Confederate prisoners were in fact transferred back to the United States, and that was the end of that affair. But there was definitely an impact of the American Civil War here in Morocco, and later on, the Moroccan Sultan, I think it was about 150 years ago, it was in 1863, that he promulgated a decree that Morocco was not to trade with the Confederacy. So since Tangier was such an international city with a real mix of populations, we have here a perfect example of that, because this man in the Union Army uniform is Felix Matthews, and he was the first American consul general with that title, consul general, in Tangier. He was born in Tangier as Feliz Mateus, Portuguese ancestry, and he goes to the United States, joins the Union Army during the Civil War, comes back as Colonel Felix Matthews, and he was the first in what is on this wall of 5 generations of the same family. So his son Jasper became the vice consul, and then this is his granddaughter Conchessa, and his great-granddaughter, who here was painted by James McBay, a famous Scottish painter who eventually settled in Tangier. And then this finally is the current generation of the same family, Anna Gabriella Bonet, who gave the American legation the portrait of her mother. And this is a nice picture of her standing in front of the portrait of her mother.